Katrina here.
Yes, I am.
Would you like to report to us?
Sure. I'll try to do it justice. So I'll just go through a number of issues that were raised. So first of all, that all of a sudden we're in this context of contact tracing, we're collecting new types of data that we were not necessarily collecting before or thinking about in this way. We need to be aware of that. We have new sets of issues that are going to come up because of that. We should be keeping in mind that any changes that happen either in the software on your phone or in terms of social norms and expectations that happen in this context of COVID are likely to persist. And so we should be aware of that we're unlikely to be able to make sort of temporary changes. What we've seen in the deployment on the tech side is, exciting on the one hand, very quickly technologists have sort of rushed to put together all sorts of interesting solutions. And there has been more discussion of privacy issues than we might have feared there would have been. At the same time, the sort of modeling of the threats and the risks involved in these deployments has been far from rigorous or thorough. And that's really concerning because we are, like I said, collecting new data, new risks, and nobody's really exposing in some rigorous way what are the trade-offs, what are the harms, what is being protected against, what is not being protected against, so that societies can make reasonable decisions. This can't be, here's the problem, technology is the solution. This has to be, technology enables the following trade-offs. We need to put that into discussion with other tools, such as those from law and policy, to try to decide what are the appropriate trade-offs to make. There was discussion of the importance in these times of public trust and social solidarity and concerns. The deployment of widespread surveillance or tracking or poor deployment thereof can be really harmful to these really, really crucial tools for governments to fight the virus. There's concern that focusing specifically on contact tracing when it's only one part of a broader system may be somewhat misplaced. We saw sort of a brief summary of the Israeli context, which is interesting in that we have sort of simultaneous deployment of two different types of technologies for doing contact tracing. One of them sort of very heavy government surveillance, non-optional. The other, an optional, somewhat privacy-oriented app, also released by the government, but by a different branch of the government. And so sort of the confusing messaging and difficulties in having sort of these two coexist. Deirdre used a phrase that I liked a lot. I don't know who to credit, and I'd love to know. She described these deployments as pre-public health applications, sort of using analogy to pre-crime, sort of this idea that we're preemptively doing this gathering. We haven't really thought through what that means and what the consequences are. We re-encountered the question that came up earlier in the talks of privacy from whom as being crucial. And a recurring theme in the discussion was the importance of making the trade-offs more transparent and more carefully analyzed so that we can really make good choices. I'll stop there. I'm sure I missed important things.
Great. Thank you. These are really important points. One of the barriers for making this more transparent is the fact that a lot of this data is being, in fact, is being collected on private infrastructure and now being governed by the API of the smartphones. And we've discussed this in Team 2 that talked about the public-private interface and the way in which Google and Apple set the norms in their API about what the data could be collected and how it is to be used. And Shafi, will you help us
So I'll be a lot shorter because I think Ayad is going to supplement me. So we talked about the public versus private. We highlighted, there was a little talk and it was highlighted the fact that Google and Apple sort of control the scene here because they make the rules, and their rules were that whatever information is obtained through their API cannot be used in a variety of ways by other, let's say, apps. There's very strict list of rules that sort of forbids you to use it for aggregation and for in other ways, where it's pretty clear that it would be very useful, even as a user, if you opted in and you had information about people that you were, let's say that you were where you were, you might volunteer that information for public health benefit. But I think that from what I understood is that it's very hard to work together with Google and Apple to get more benefit out of just being notified that you were close to someone within the last 14 days who may have been tested positive. And the issue with that is, first of all, is that they have control, and sort of in principle, that's something that's problematic. But we've also come up with this question of whether this gives them an unfair advantage in the market. And it came up this issue that there's competition law, and this gives them really unfair advantages in terms of their competition with other companies. And that's also because this app is expected to be used cross-border. That's another aspect in which they can control the market more. Now, not only do they have unfair advantage within, let's say, maybe the US, but also cross-border because it's going to be used more widely that way. So that's quite interesting in terms of what's something that, if it, what is law that governs the fairness of their market share. Another thing, another sort of provocative thing that Noam brought up was to say that, it's an interesting case here to contrast what's happening between the West and the East, East meaning China and so forth, where they can actually figure out exactly where you're at, what you should do. You get some kind of announcement on your phone telling you, can you, go on the subway or not, which seems to be actually quite relevant to controlling the pandemic, whereas we are trying to use this private and public and be careful and adhere to the fact that maybe Apple and Google don't want to destroy their market credibility and so forth, and therefore the amount of information you could get is very limited. And so the controversial question is, can the West, can our democracy really match what can be done in an authoritarian regime at a time like this? So we would like to, but can we really? And it's a challenge to do so. This is all I take. Eyal, do you want to add?
Maybe yes. Maybe one thing that came about is that even if we take the view of Google, Apple regarding the need for a decentralized solution and preserving privacy and not gathering data, the protocol that Google and Apple implemented does several trade-offs regarding with privacy and security and explainability. And those trade-offs might be suitable to specific countries, but might be less than optimal for other countries that have different social and legal norms regarding the way that they try to combat COVID-19. Maybe one thing that is very clear is that, for example, in Israel, the location history of COVID-19 patient is something that is published. It published in newspapers and in several websites and Telegram channels. So trying to say it's very important to hide the location of COVID-19 positive people or persons is something that doesn't really make sense in the specific legal and social norms in Israel. And this is something that has a price in explainability and in security when we try to implement the protocol. And this one size fit all of the world solution is something that might raise many difficulties, and Google, Apple will not negotiate with anyone on the specific modification and changes. And when they control the market, they do not allow people to actually solve or try to combat the COVID-19 in the optimal way that they can.
Thank you. This is, of course, relates to the possibility of different interpretations of privacy, depending on the country, the needs, and the culture, maybe. And again, once it is designed by the API, there is no room for experimentation and varieties in developing these different concepts. It also has to do with trust, right? One of the issues that we discuss is whether you trust the government and you need the companies to protect you against the government, or whether you trust the companies, right? And that leads us to the third team that we had, talking about mandatory apps and voluntary apps. And I think Oren was moderating this.
Yeah, so again, I'll try to do justice, although I'm sure I will fail. So I'll focus on my own takeaways from this very interesting session. So the first thing that I learned is that voluntary versus mandatory is a false dichotomy. In fact, there are there's a range of mechanisms on this spectrum. And they start from voluntary, when we just try to convince people to internalize a certain set of norms of what they should be doing and what they should not be doing. Then there are various types of choice architecture or nudge type interventions. And then there are mandatory rules that we might put in place. And basically the kind of set of sanctions or incentives that we could design, again, can range from very weak to very strong, and we have a very large spectrum of possibilities. And so when we take this from the Yuval's kind of legal or behavioral ethics perspective to the economics of CS that Michal and Yuval were teaching us about, then we might call the same thing, or we might talk about mechanism design or design of the rules, or the rules of the game, the legal rules of the game. And there are various options of how we would be designing these rules. Again, thinking about kind of incentives and carrots and sticks and internalization, and understanding that if we have too strong an incentive, it might crowd out kind of the internal motivations of various types of actors to comply with the norm, the legal norm, or the ethical norm. There is, of course, large empirical questions that we need to figure out in terms of what kind of populations we are dealing with. Neva mentioned before that we have different people in different countries and issues of trust. Some people will just do what is right if we tell them and explain why this is the right thing to do. Other people need stronger incentives. How do we kind of balance these two things together? The mechanism design literature that we kind of learned about and talked about focuses on questions of lying and cheating, and how can we design the mechanism in the way that people will not lie and cheat. Okay, so one example was, we're talking about contact tracing. The concern is, even if we mandate, have these kind of mandatory applications, or even like the Israeli Secret Service or Shabak doing this for us, people might leave their phones at home. Now, for me personally, this seems kind of unthinkable to leave my phone at home, but I understand that some people do this. And so again, how do we decide? How do we design the system to make sure that people don't do this? Again, from a general enforcement perspective, take your phone with you whenever you go out of the house is a rule like any other rule, and we can think about the ways to enforce this if we think that that is the right rule to have. So this was one set of issues that we've discussed, and it has to do with kind of the range of options and mechanisms and legal regimes that we can think about. The other thing that we touched about, albeit briefly, is now that we know the range of possibilities, we don't know yet, but let's say we know the range of possibilities, how do we choose between them on the spectrum between voluntary and mandatory and everything in between? And the idea is that we need to think very hard about our objective function, and how do we quantify the cost of privacy and compare this in a general cost-benefit analysis to the cost and benefits in terms of kind of morbidity or mortality rates that we might be, the benefits in reduced mortality and morbidity that we might get on kind of a stronger, more kind of on the mandatory side of the spectrum as compared to the voluntary side. So those are, at least for me, the main takeaways.
Great, thank you. Our last team was discussing issues related to transparency and accountability that are probably one of the measures for building trust and encouraging people to voluntarily opt into a system. And here we have Vince.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
I actually tried to very quickly type up slides, and I'm going to try to share those with you now. Or can you see them?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So we had two wonderful talks by, let me try to move this over here. You can still see it?
Yes.
Okay.
You just have to put it on display
better?
mode.
Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Good. So we had two wonderful invited talks by Professor Canetti from BU Computer Science and Professor Strandberg from NYU Law, Kathy. And so we'll start with Kathy's talk. And she emphasized that, well, when we think about transparency, generally often we think about algorithms in AI that are a little bit more difficult to understand. Whereas here, these kind of apps, at least it's pretty clear what they're supposed to do. Maybe it's not understandable by everyone, but at least we can get a pretty good handle on it. And so in that sense, it's different. Also, maybe we're not quite as worried about public health authorities having incentives to do things that they shouldn't be doing as we might be with some other private companies. So we'll get back to that in a second. But participation is a key worry because it's very hard to coerce people, at least in our societies, to participate in these things. And so that's going to probably be the main issue. And we need trust for people to be willing to participate. And a good starting point might be to compare to traditional contact tracing. And what do we worry about there? We mostly worry about information leakage. There are various kinds of information that you might be concerned about it leaking. And who is going to get this information? So traditionally, in the traditional setup, the public health authorities and maybe researchers would get it. And there you might still worry about some kind of mission creep that they want to do more with this data than they were supposed to. In the digital world, there are various new issues that come up. So first of all, we have new entities involved, such as the smartphone companies and the app designers that traditionally don't play a role in the contact tracing. And there are new kinds of data that appear as well. An interesting point that Kathy made was that normally in the traditional world, sometimes there's some retroactive filtering of data that they decide that some data maybe shouldn't be in there after all, which you might have other concerns about, but now that's no longer a possibility. So that's going to have some effect potentially. And there's also the potential for new kinds of mission creeps because the holders of the data are now different, have different incentives. And in addition to that, there's maybe the mission creep of the technology itself, that it can be expanded to new purposes that maybe we wouldn't have expected. So Kathy's conclusion overall was that we should be worrying about much more than we typically do when we just think about privacy preservation. Then Ron talked for a little while. And so he mentioned this issue that, well, we have to trade off various basic values here between individualism, social responsibility, centralization and decentralization, many other things. And we would like this discussion to be driven by what is technically possible. But when we think about what's technically possible, as a computer scientist, maybe the first thing we think about is, well, here are various tools for multi-party computation and cryptography more generally that in theory solve all these problems, and so we're done. But it's not quite that simple in practice, again, because we need this trust. If people are not willing to buy into it, it doesn't matter that it has all the properties that we would like it to have. So Ron was very positive about the GA mechanism in that it's simple, there are no secret databases, there seem to be no options for clandestine use, and maybe it's even a model for future intervention in other kinds of settings. But then we had some questions that maybe were skeptical about some of these aspects. So Elliot worried about there still being a possibility to match identities in reality. And well, in security, there's always this concern that there's some kind of strange way around the protections that we hadn't thought of before. So it's hard to say that anything is ever fully secure. But at least this kind of matching would seem to be difficult to scale to very large numbers of people. Voluntary participation, whether that's feasible is still a big question. There's also the issue that it's not necessarily the same for everyone, right? I think we heard before that maybe the dichotomy between mandatory and voluntary is a false one. And we touched on that a little bit as well, that, you know, maybe it's not that voluntary if you work in a big warehouse and they need to be compliant and they can push you to participate in all this. Kira mentioned that, well, maybe the model that these apps are being built on is a little bit outdated now. It's based on this idea that you're within 6 feet of each other, but that now doesn't seem to be necessarily the only determinant. It's maybe more important whether people wear masks, if you're inside, if there's ventilation, can we get that in? And the response to that, well, mostly that's not going to be in there. So it's not going to be the best possible thing that we could ever have. But maybe it's still helpful in many ways, in particular in finding super spreaders. And so we try to just do the best we can. And then we had several questions about the role of law and the role of institutions. Do we need new institutions? Do we need new laws? I think Kathy was leaning towards this being, let's keep this to be a special purpose application, so that, you know, we don't want to necessarily cover all this with general laws. This seems to be pretty specific to public health, and maybe that's how we should be thinking about it also in terms of the governing institutions. But of course, there is a question whether we really can keep it that separate from other kinds of application as well. And that's all we have.
Great. Excellent. Wow, this has been a really rich discussion in the rooms, and I think for all of us, it's just a teaser for the type of discussion that we could have had on each of these topics for a whole session. But unfortunately, we're now going to have to take a break of 10 minutes. We're coming back at 11:30 for our concluding keynote of the day and the discussant. So we'll hear from Herr Varian and from Michal Gal. So please come back at 11:30. Those of you who wish to chat, we can stay, you know, during the break. If you don't need the 10 minutes, you're welcome to stay.